of different findings about what's going on with old people is that the old people in one study may be a lot older or a lot younger than the old people in another study. This gets even worse if you're going back and sampling studies from a few decades back. You should read some earlier review papers about things like sensation or slowing and so on. Some of the earliest work done on older adults used people who were like 35, 40. Even now, you see in some studies the older adult sample is going to be say like 50 to 70, and then another study it'll be like 65 to 95, or even 70 to 95. So you can get like completely non-overlapping groups. And even if you have overlapping groups, if you've got one group that has a pretty sizable number of people in their 80s and 90s, and another study that doesn't, this can make a difference in what people are finding. And so one thing I suggest that people do is if you're looking at several studies and combining them to a paper, if you're seeing differences, take a look at how the subjects differ across the studies, and they give you a clue to why. You may also want to look at other ways that they differ, like whether one sample is all female and another one has some men in it. There's a variety of things, ways that you can introduce apparent age effects that really aren't age. The other thing that's almost always true, particularly in cross-sectional studies, is that the age range for the older adults is usually absolutely enormous compared to the age range for the younger adults. Because if you're recruiting your young sample from the college population, you've got people that are going to be about 18 to 25, maybe 18 to 30, 35 for the most part. And your older adult population is like whoever you can get, right? So you've got people from like 55 to 102. And so you've got one sample where you've got a range of, your young people, you've got like a 7-year age range, and your older adults, you've got like a 30-plus year age range. Second bullet point here is, where do the older adults come from? There's actually a lot of variation on this. One of the ones that's caused probably the most havoc in gerontology and geropsychology is that for a long time in the beginning of the field, pretty much everybody got their older adult samples in nursing homes, and then back in the days when we used to have them also in state hospital geropsychiatric units. Now that the state hospitals are gone, you don't do so much of that. But so you have mostly institutional samples of older adults compared to young adults in college. You're bound to get some differences, but there's all kinds of reasons for that. And this you want to think about for your own purposes. If you're interested in generalizing the results to nursing homes, then you probably want your research to be based on nursing home samples that are as similar as possible to the nursing homes that you want to generalize to. But if you're interested in community-dwelling older adults, you don't want nursing home samples informing what you think about community-dwelling older adults. And more generally, you don't want to base theories of normal aging on older adults in nursing homes, because they're not aging normally. Even in community samples, you can get all interesting kinds of bias. I was sitting with a group of people in Division 20, some social event. I think we were in Boston doing one of those duck tours. And you ride around and then you go into the water and stuff. So, we do what, geropsychologists do at social events. Yeah, but these are like, they're like tanks almost. And they drive around the city streets and then they go down to the harbor and you drive out into the water and check them. So, being a really fun-loving crowd, we do what we do when geropsychologists get together. We talk about our research samples and our data analysis technique. This is true, actually. I'm not making this up. And one of the things that intrigued me is that there was a lot of people who were talking about the results that they got that were often being interpreted as kind of supporting positive aging results. And it turned out that many of them were working in university communities in the Northeast United States, where just about everybody, if you go out and recruit a normal community sample, out in the community through senior recreation centers. 75–80% of your sample are retired professors with PhDs. So, I mean, it's an interesting sample if you're interested in retired faculty members. But, it's another question, how generalizable is this sample likely to be? So, one of the things that very frequently happens in comparisons of young and old adults is that you tend to get more educated older adults. If you're recruiting college sophomores, they can only have 14 years of education, right? Recruiting older adults, they don't. If you're recruiting a representative sample, they won't have, but they can have 16, 21, whatever years of education. Again, just something that's interesting to keep an eye on when you're looking at studies and thinking about why studies are different, but also interesting in terms of what samples you want to generalize from. Is your older sample likely to mostly be physically healthy, or do you think there are a lot of sick people in the sample? Particularly on cognitive aging issues, emotion and aging issues, physical illness, chronic illness and disability also has a lot of the kinds of effects that we attribute to aging. Now, if you're interested in sick people, this is exactly what you want. You probably want to know what kind of sickness they have. But if you're interested in healthy aging, then you want healthier people. As we'll talk about when we get into the literature on intelligence and aging, one of the issues for knowing what normal changes in intelligence are is whether there are people with dementia in the sample. We're getting better about not going to nursing homes where 3/4 of the people are dementia to do the research, but the way that we screen out people with dementia it's tricky to do it, first of all. Most of the ways that we do it probably aren't very good. You probably want to think about sample sizes. This kind of cuts in both directions, actually. A lot of the people that we get in grad school, particularly in gerontology, have kind of a social gero background, and people end up loving these really huge, nationally representative samples. The sort of the other extreme is if you're in the kind of lab-based experimental psych, people say things like, well, if you can't see it in a sample of 20 to 30 people, it's not a big enough effect to be interesting. And there's other reasons for doing experimental research, but there's actually some justification for that. One of the things that you get into in very large samples is that everything is statistically significant, and then you need to think about how big the effects are that you're interested in. And there's no kind of clean answer to the question, but you probably want to think in terms of what's the kind of the right sample sizes for what you're studying. Obviously, biased small samples are probably a problem. You just kind of want to think about what some of these issues are as you're critiquing things. And then whether you need national size samples and national sampling to draw conclusions. One of the most common things I've seen in papers for classes over the last few years is people will criticize a paper and say, well, this was done in Pittsburgh, and so we really only know that this applies to people in Pittsburgh. And, well, that could actually be true. For some psychological variables, there probably are regionally significant effects, but I think you need to take it the next step and say, why do you think people in Pittsburgh would be different on this? I think there are some variables where you can make a good case for that. There are other variables where why would you think people in one part of the country would be any different from people in the other part of the country? So you just you probably don't need national samples for everything. You probably do need them for some things. Any questions or comments about the sample stuff? Everybody's crystal clear or stunned. Okay, so done with the sample, the next thing to think about is just kind of basic design issues. All of this stuff we're going to be going over again and again in the next several lectures. We'll be looking at it around specific studies in class too.